Here's your paper, Mr. Fixer.
Hey, is it that time already?
Well, it's 5 o'clock, and boy, am I glad.
Are you tired again, Jimmy?
I'm always tired, Mr. Fixer.
You know, I'm beginning to believe you, son. Do you realize you've been tired every night? Well, for at least a month? Is there something wrong with you?
No, I'm just tired of working. That's all I do, and the other kids are out playing.
Well, this business of being poor is no fun, Jimmy, but there are lots worse things.
What?
Well, you could be like Freddie Benson. Looks like Freddie will have to spend the rest of his life in that thing.
Yeah, I guess you're right, Mr. Fixer.
You're just feeling sort of low today, aren't you, partner? Why don't you sit down over here for a minute? You know, Jimmy, it's only natural to be discouraged once in a while. But do you remember when you accepted Christ as your own personal Savior? When you accepted Christ, son, you became a member of God's family. And there isn't anything that ever happens to you that God doesn't know about. Well, the Bible tells us that all things work together for good to them that love the Lord. You know what that means? Well, these things you're going through with now, sure, they're tough. But they'll make a man out of you, son. And if you're the right kind of a man, God can use you. Why, you don't know, God may have big things planned for you.
Well, that sounds good, but I don't know what he'd want me for. I'm the biggest nobody in school.
A nobody, huh? Did you ever hear the story of Gideon?
No.
I think you should hear it, Jimmy. It's a story that'll warm your heart. It's a story of a poor boy. Well, to use your own words, a nobody. A very unimportant person who was used of God to do a very important job. And it's a thrilling story because it's true. We know it's true because it's here in the Bible. Now, before we can really understand the story of Gideon, we need to know a little bit about his people and what happened to them. Gideon's people were known as the Israelites, and at the time of our story, the land of Israel was being overrun with thousands of people who just drifted from one place to another, living off of what they could steal. Now, these drifters were known as the Midianites. Israel as a nation became poverty-stricken because the Midianites forced them to give up not only their homes and their land, but even their food and their clothing. Hopelessly outnumbered, the Israelites left their homes and fled for their lives into the wilderness. And living in the wilderness was no fun. The Israelites had a real struggle for existence. The rich people became poor, and the poor people became destitute. And we read in the Bible that Gideon's family was one of the poorest families in all of Israel. Now, not only that, Gideon was the youngest boy, and back in those days, that meant he was the least important. Whenever there was work to be done, Gideon was certain to get more than his share. So when an angel told Gideon that God had chosen him to deliver Israel from these Midianites, well, Gideon's reaction was much as we might have expected it to be. Me? I'm supposed to do that? Gideon felt sure that a mistake had been made. He told the angel that his family was poor, and being the youngest boy, well, he was just nobody at all. But the angel insisted that no mistake had been made. Gideon was the one God had chosen.
What did Gideon do then?
Well, Jimmy, what would you have done? Let's suppose for a moment that you're Gideon, and the Lord has just told you that you're the man to deliver your people from their enemies. What would you do?
Well, I guess I'd get the men together and get them ready to fight.
Well, that's what Gideon did. He gathered together all the men who were able to fight, and when a total count was taken, there was 32,000 men.
Hey, that's better than I thought.
Now, wait a minute, Jimmy. This is one nation of people against another. 32,000 is not a very big army.
Well, how many men did the Midianites have?
According to the Bible, there were 135,000 of them.
Against how many Israelites?
32,000.
What did Gideon do?
Well, he set up his camp and he organized his men. But no sooner had Gideon done this than God spoke to him and told him the size of his army was too big.
Too big?
Yes, God told Gideon that if the battle was won with all these men, they'd think they'd won by themselves. So Gideon was to tell the men that were afraid to fight to leave the army and to go home. Now, some of the men stood their ground, but many of them were afraid to fight even though God had promised their leader the victory. Now Gideon's army was only 1/3 as big as it had been. Of course, they were good soldiers. They weren't afraid to fight, but all that was left was 10,000 men. Gideon was beginning to realize the true meaning of faith in God. Only God knew how such a small army could possibly win. But Gideon's faith was put to an even greater test when God spoke to him again and told him his army was still too big. And he told Gideon what to do about it. Gideon was to take his men down to some water, and there he was to tell them to drink, to satisfy their thirst. All but 300 of the men bowed down upon their knees to drink the water. And the Lord told Gideon to send these men back to their tents.
The 300, you mean?
The 9,700. 300 men were all that Gideon had left.
Boy, I sure don't understand that.
Well, I doubt if Gideon understood it either. But, Jimmy, one thing had become very clear. Unless God performed a miracle, 300 men were committing suicide. So you see, it was only on a basis of faith that Gideon could possibly go ahead with such a plan. The midnight hour was the time for changing the guard in the Midianite camp. All this provided a wonderful opportunity for Gideon and his men to do what God had told them to. As far as the Midianites were concerned, there was nothing surrounding their camp but the wide open spaces. But Gideon and his men were stealing through that darkness on a very unusual mission. Every man carried a pitcher in one hand and a trumpet in the other. Now, every man carried a torch too, but the torches were hidden inside the pitchers. When all the men had taken their positions around the camp, they watched their leader to do exactly as he would do. And all of a sudden, Gideon blew on his trumpet, he broke his pitcher, he held high his torch and cried out, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." All around the camp, the 300 did as their leader had done. The Midianites were terrified. They thought their camp had been surrounded. A great army was taking them by surprise. Where could they go? What could they do? And the Midianites did the only thing they could think of doing. They ran. Like a herd of wild animals, they stampeded. And the Bible tells us that right in the middle of all this confusion, Gideon and his men blew on their horns again. Strange thing happened to the Midianites. They turned and fought each other. And when the battle was over, God had given Gideon a tremendous victory because Gideon believed in God enough to let him do it.
I wish I was like Gideon.
I don't know of any reason why you can't be.
Me? Oh, you're kidding.
No, I'm not, Jimmy. Look, what was it that made Gideon so different? Was it his clothes? The money to buy a fountain pen? Okay, Jimmy, what was it that nobody had so much of?
Faith?
That's what I wanted to hear. No matter what happened to Gideon, he kept his faith, didn't he?
Yeah, but it was easier for him than for us, though.
Oh, how do you figure that?
Well, Gideon knew what God wanted. God talked to him.
Jimmy, God has more to say to you than he ever had to say to Gideon. Right here.
You mean if I read the Bible, I'll know what God wants me to do?
Look, Jimmy, this isn't just a storybook. This is God talking to you, telling you about all the wonderful things that are yours. if you'll only have faith, the kind of faith Gideon had.
How do you get that kind of faith, Mr. Fix-It?
Well, let's see what God has to say about it. Over here in the book of Romans, in the 10th chapter and the 17th verse, we read, "Faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God."
Morning, Mr. Fix-It.
Hi, Johnny. Morning, Joe.
Hi.
Hey, you fellas are up bright and early.
I thought maybe you could fix something for me.
What is it, Johnny?
Oh, it's just a solar reel. All of a sudden it won't work.
This shouldn't be too difficult. Would you like to pick it up this afternoon?
Could you do it now, Mr. Fix-It?
Now? I might be able to. It all depends on what's wrong with it. Planning on using it sometime soon?
Yeah, sometime today, maybe.
This morning?
Yeah, we thought about it. Since it's kind of early.
Yes, it is a little early for school, all right. But how far is it to the river, Joe?
Oh, about a mile, I expect.
That's what I was thinking. You'd hardly have time to get down to the river and back before school began, would you? You know what I'm beginning to think, boys?
What, Mr. Fix-It?
I'm beginning to wonder if you planned on going to school this morning.
See, I told you should have gone on.
Now, wait a minute, Joe. We've all been good friends a long time, haven't we?
Yeah?
Johnny's reel needed fixing, so he brings it into me. What's wrong with that?
Well, nothing except now you'll tell on us.
I'll never tell a soul.
Honest?
Honest.
Nobody will ever know.
Wrong again, Joe. Somebody else already knows.
Somebody else?
That's right, Joe. There isn't anything that we ever say or think or do that he doesn't know about. Had you thought about that? You should think about it. It's mighty important to do what the Lord wants you to do.
You mean the Lord cares if we go fishing?
Now, come on, Johnny. You know better than that. It's playing hooky that I'm talking about. I know a story I think you boys ought to hear. You'd still be at school in plenty of time.
What's it about, Mr. Fix-It?
Well, Joe, it's about a man, a fish, a big fish, and a city of people. Would you like to hear it? Okay. Put your books down. And, Johnny, you bring that box to sit on. Get out the storybook. And we'll just take a look at that city of people. Nineveh was great in many ways, fellas. It was the capital of Assyria, and it was big in size and in population. And through the many years Nineveh had existed, the sins of her people had become very great indeed. Now the king of Nineveh was a man of war. His every thought was of how to enlarge his empire, and his armies were conquering first one country and then another, and all the time they were coming closer and closer to the borderland of Israel. The people who lived in Israel were getting pretty uneasy about all of this. There had never been any friendly feeling between the Israelites and the Assyrians because they looked at things so differently. The people of Israel worshiped God, and their faith was the very center of all they thought and believed in. But the people of Nineveh were heathens. They worshipped images made out of stone. So the Israelites had good reason to wonder about the Assyrians and what they were going to do next.
Well, what about the big fish?
Well, that comes in the next part of our story, Joe. Living in the land of Israel was a man by the name of Jonah. Now, Jonah was a prophet of God. Or in other words, Jonah delivered messages from God to the people. One day, Jonah became quite concerned about something God had told him. Jonah was to take a message to the people of Nineveh. Jonah was to go and tell the people of Nineveh that because of their terrible sins, their city would be destroyed. But Jonah didn't want to go. Nineveh was far away, and the Assyrians weren't very friendly. Why should they be warned? Why didn't God just go ahead and destroy the city? So instead of doing what God told him to do, Jonah boarded a boat that was sailing in the opposite direction from the city of Nineveh. And as the boat pulled away from the shore, Jonah thought to himself, I'll get so far away from Israel that God will forget about me. I won't hear any more about going to preach to those heathen people. And after a while, Jonah felt so sure that it was all over with, he simply quit thinking about it. He went down inside the ship, and soon he was fast asleep, never realizing that God was planning to teach him a lesson he would never forget. As the prophet lay sleeping below the deck, a storm came up, the likes of which the sailors had never seen. The sailors knew that no boat could last through a storm like this one. They fell to their knees and they cried out for their lives to be spared. But the wind blew all the harder. The captain of the ship told Jonah to wake up and to call on his God to save him. But Jonah's position was awkward, to say the least. How could Jonah call on God when he was trying to run away from him? In desperation, the men on the ship drew lots to see who could be responsible for all this trouble. And you know, it just so happened that Jonah was found to be the guilty one. And the sailors demanded to know who he was and what he had done to bring all of this upon them. And Jonah could hide it no longer. He told them everything, and he begged them to throw him overboard before they were all killed. And because there was nothing else left to do, the sailors did just that. And right away the storm was over, and the waves began to go down. And as Jonah struggled to keep from sinking, a great fish appeared and actually swallowed this man who had tried to run away from God.
The fish swallowed the man?
That's right, Joe. Here, hold the book a minute, Johnny. We read here in the book of Jonah, the first chapter and the last verse, the Lord had prepared a great fish to swallow up Jonah. So you see, God did this very thing to teach Jonah a lesson. And then we read, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. So you see, he had plenty of time to think about what he had done and be sorry for it. And he was, and he prayed to God. And then over here we read, and the Lord spake unto the fish, and it threw Jonah right out onto the dry land. Well, needless to say, that was enough for Jonah. Right away, he headed for the city of Nineveh. And the Assyrians were greatly surprised when this stranger walked boldly into their city and cried out, Within 40 days, Nineveh will be destroyed. And on he went all through the great city, telling the people of the coming destruction. Within 40 days, Nineveh will be destroyed. And everywhere he went, the people listened. They believed Jonah. And God used the words of the prophet to bring conviction to the hearts of the people. And when the king heard about it, he too was aware of the sin in his life. And the king was sorry for his sinful ways, and he took off his royal garments and dressed in sackcloth and sat in ashes, and pleaded for mercy in the sight of God. All over the city, the people were following the example of their king. They were begging God to forgive them. And because God is a God of mercy, he forgave them for their sins. So you see how important it was, fellas, for Jonah to do as God had told him to do? Why, a whole city of people were saved.
But God's never told us anything to do, has he, Joe?
Oh, yes, he has. Aren't you forgetting about this, fellas? God wanted to teach us a lesson the same as Jonah. That's why the story's in here.
But is there something in there about ditching school, Mr. Fix-It?
Yes, I think there is. Over here in Colossians, chapter 3 and verse 20. Before I read it to you, I want to ask you a question. Did your parents ever tell you not to ditch school?
Oh, sure, but that's different.
Is it, Johnny? Look, you read it. Right here.
Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing unto the Lord. Boy, I never knew that was there. Did you, Joe?
Puts a different light on things, doesn't it, fellas?
Boy, I'll say, I'd be scared to skip school now.
The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, Johnny. And I think all of us ought to be afraid of disobeying God. But listen, fellas, God doesn't want you to be afraid of him. He loves you. And any time he speaks to you through the words